All right, students, let's get going. Topic, 20th century, 1900 to present time. Our essential question, how did the Cold War divide the world? So we talked about World War II in our last boards and how the Cold War derived out of that. We've got the Cuban Revolution. The United States supports Cuba after the Spanish-American War until 1956, when many peasants didn't feel supported. That's when you had the likes of Fidel Castro begins a communist revolution against the Batista dictatorship. The United States was very worried about communism. The communists and the ties to the USSR tried to overthrow Castro numerous times. There were many plots to try to assassinate him. One of those was the Bay of Pigs invasion on the southern part of Cuba, which did not work. The CIA had a hand in that, but it was unsuccessful. With the help of the USSR, Cuba then gains nuclear missiles. Castro feels that he has a right to protect himself against the United States. And this leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States and Cuba kind of squared off at each other in the early 60s, in which Cuba finally disarmed in 1962. And this is probably the closest we ever came in history up to this point to a nuclear war. Now, in Latin America, Latin American countries, the United States still has a heavy hand in Latin American governments, overthrowing numerous governments with the help of the CIA. Socialist countries, Guatemala, Nicaragua, still to this day have unstable governments based off of some of the interactions that we had in this, and I say we, the United States, had in this region. Chile and Brazil have the largest economies coming out of their independence movements and into the 20th century, and they have the largest economies to this day. All right, our next board here. The Cold War ends. So, Eastern Bloc countries could not keep up with Western economies. In the early 1980s, movements began to split from USSR. Lech Walesa led Poland and Polish workers in the solidarity movement. The Communist Party, backed by the USSR, arrested Lech Walesa, who was a great leader at this time in Poland. In 1989, solidarity was legalized, and in 1990 reformed. Walesa was elected as president. Also during this time, the split Germany was reunited in 1989 after the Berlin Wall was torn down, which is a monumental undertaking to have this Berlin Wall torn down and in communism in Eastern Germany. Now the Soviet Union begins to weaken as countries split from the USSR. Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 began a process of glasnost, or openness. In 1991, the USSR collapsed and disintegrates. Satellite countries split and become independent, such as the Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and there are many others. The Balkan region is once again a hotbed for controversy. In the early 90s, Bosnia and Albanian Muslims killed by Christian Serbs. Thousands were killed in the early 90s. The UN had to step in to help, this was a terrible ethnic cleansing that took place in this Balkan region, which is the same area where World War I started. All right, democracy forms in former USSR, which is now Russia. Boris Yeltsin tries to rule, but has many problems. Their economy during the time period of the 1990s was terrible. And in the year 2000, Putin is elected as president, and he is still ruler to this day. Now, independence movements in Africa and Asia. The British grant independence to India, but India falls into civil war and splits between Hindu and Muslim, so it's more like a religious war. Mahatma Gandhi leads the movement with a passive resistance or civil disobedience towards the British, and it was with the help of Mahatma Gandhi that the Indian people were able to form their own government in their own country. India becomes mostly Hindu, while the formation of Pakistan and Bangladesh become mostly Muslim. Now, the country of South Africa, under apartheid rules, becomes a country in 1910, separating from the British. And this idea of apartheid rule is where the white minority rule a very large majority of blacks, and it is a very racist idea, and they would have to live under this rule for some 80 years until the 1990s, when apartheid was dismantled and Nelson Mandela became the first black president of the country. Now, countries along the Mediterranean Sea were the next to claim freedom. Many sub-Saharan countries gained their independence in the 1950s and 1960s. Last board here. Now, one example of sub-Saharan African country is Rwanda, that gained its independence from Germany and Belgium. Rwanda was a terrible example of how European influence made it difficult for African countries to flourish with freedom. And it's still to this day, many African countries are still caught up in turmoil, and I believe there's one country where the ruler's been ruling for like 30 years. He's 93 years old and plans to run again in 2018. All right, so what happened in Rwanda is the Tutsi 15% minority helped German and Belgium colonists brutally rule the colony. So this minority helped the German and Belgians rule. When the German and Belgian people left, the Hutu, or 85% majority, not happy with the Tutsi, take over and kill thousands of Tutsis. And so in the early 1900s, or 1990s, I'm sorry, between 800,000 to 2 million Tutsis were killed because of this ethnic violence, and it was absolutely horrendous. Now in the Middle East, after World War II, Middle Eastern countries fight for independence. France and British controlled much of the Middle East, so they were constantly trying to gain their independence from those two European powers. Middle Eastern countries formed under European control, which backfired 20 or 30 years later for some who wanted to be controlled by a religion. So the British, to some point the Americans, the French, helped these countries form a government, but then 20 or 30 years later, like in Iran, this backfired, and a religious government now controls Iran. In this region, I'm sorry, let me back up. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 by British Foreign Secretary pushed for the Zionist movement and the creation for a state of Israel. So while in the Middle East, most countries that were formed were Islamic, and still are, all the way back in 1917, there was a push, and even before this, for a Zionist movement or a creation of a state of Israel, and this would finally come about after World War II, and that's what we'll start our next boards with in the future. So remember, history's no mystery. Take good notes.